Hi everybody, and welcome to the third of our Green Shoots webinars. So this is a webinar series where we've been bringing together sort of early career and more experienced academics to share and discuss research related to rewilding. If you missed any of our previous webinars, they're all available to watch on the wildE website. And after today's webinar, we'll also be posting this webinar on the website as well. The webinars are part of the wildE project, which is an EU-funded project aiming to develop a climate-smart approach to rewilding. So the goal of wildE is really to develop and test approaches to rewilding that are scalable and benefit nature, climate, local economies, and local people. Joining today's webinar, we have Tim and Jette, both from the University of Copenhagen. We have a sort of a short 20-minute presentation before we involve you, the audience, in some more interactive elements. So we're using a platform called Mentimeter to get your input, and we'll also have a Q&A. If you've got any questions for our panelists, then you can post them in the Zoom chat that we'll be monitoring, and then we'll sort of ask those during the Q&A section of the webinar. And the entire webinar will be around 1 hour long, so we'll aim to finish at 11. So yeah, now I'll hand over to Tim, who's going to introduce you to today's topic.
Wonderful. Thank you, James. Hello, everyone. I'm Tim de Kruiff. I'm a PhD here at the University of Copenhagen. And our team primarily consists of environmental economists. And we work with rewilding in different ways. But today I really want to talk about how does rewilding affect the recreational value of natural areas. But before we actually get into that, I kind of want to take a step back because we often get the questions, what do we environmental economists do in a project such as wildE, where we work with rewilding in a broader sense? And what is our role in such a consortium? And for us, if you really break it down, economics is kind of like all about choices. So it's about the choices, which product do you buy, or the choices of what policy effects will you choose to affect certain outcomes. So we all look in economics at the behavior of people and at the choices people or policy makes. And for us as environmental economists, that's not really any different. We also look at choices, but then we look at choices within the environmental domain. So a question you might ask is, why do we prefer one forest over another? So here's a picture of, on the one side, a plantation forest, and on the other side, a rainforest. And we can ask ourselves, why would we want one forest over the other? So the plantation forest might give us, in this case, palm oil, or give us some other direct marketable goods that we can extract, whereas the other one might give us goods such as biodiversity, maybe climate sequestration. We might have some tourism there, and depending on who you ask, one forest might be better than the other. What we really do at our department is trying to take a societal point of view. So we're trying to assess, so from a broad welfare perspective, which of the forests would be best, and looking at it from different angles. And there, an important thing to understand is that we think of this in a very broad sense, with a broad sense of goods that you might not have associated before with economics, right? I'm already talking about goods here, but from the plantation forest is very easy to understand. You might have palm oil that you can sell, maybe some other things like timber, but goods such as biodiversity or carbon or other components, or the fact that we like that these forests are there, they might not always have a marketable value, right? It's not a good that we buy. To illustrate it a bit further, I want to take an example, and this is an example that, well, the people listening from the Netherlands, they will recognize this, but this area is Amelisweert. Amelisweert is a forest very close to my hometown, Utrecht. It's where I grew up. In Utrecht. And I used to go to Amelisweert and used to visit it and play around there, but I've never had to pay an entry fee to get to Amelisweert. Right? I've always just been able to go there. And that forest also has some biodiversity. It also sequesters some carbon. It does a lot of different things, but we don't really usually pay for that directly. But we find it important. And people from the Netherlands will know there's, for example, a highway next to it, which they're talking about expanding. And we can see people care about this forest because there's a lot of protests going on right now to make sure to try to stop this broadening of the highway. And even me, now that I've been moving to Copenhagen, I'm far away. Even for me, I still care about Amelisweert, even though I might never visit it. And if you would ask me the question, okay, would you be willing to pay an additional 50 euros a year to make sure that this road doesn't become broader, but stays how it is and we protect Amelisweert? I'll be happy to pay that. And that brings us to a subject or to a term that we're going to talk a bit more during this presentation. It's called willingness to pay. So in this space, we talk what is the willingness to pay for a natural good. So what do? We tend to, how do we approach sort of valuing nature, and how do we do this? So what we tend to do is we tend to give people, at least how I work, is using the stated preferences methods. And these stated preferences are that we give people the option between two different, let's say, nature areas in this case. So we have an area with a forest, and we have an area that maybe has more agriculture, and they have different prices. So this could be, for example, income tax that you have to pay in a year. And we constantly ask people over and over, which would you like? So would you like the forest, or would you like the more agriculture for this and this cost profile? And by repeating that choice, we start to figure out what will people really like. And that's how we try to value nature. And then in that way, you know, we also try to understand, okay, what is important for these choices of one nature area over another. And we might try to find groups of people with similar preferences. So groups of people that think similarly in a way, or try to understand how this looks like in a group. And in case of recreation, such as we're doing today, we might not ask how much would you be willing to pay, but we will be asking how much would you be willing to travel, right? So there would be two forests, for example, that look slightly different, that represent slightly different, and you'll see an example in a bit. And we would ask, and one forest is 5 kilometers away and the other one is 10 kilometers away. And we ask, which one would you like to visit? And we constantly repeat these questions with different forests. And as such, we try to ascertain how far people are willing to travel to visit a certain forest. And with that, we can kind of understand how important they find certain components. And how does this then relate to rewilding? Well, in our research, what we're doing is we're looking at different aspects of rewilding, such as maybe these large mammals, these large animals that are often talked about, but also components such as abiotic rewilding, right? How much space does a river get, or how do we deal with disturbances? We try to understand how these aspects of rewilding affect the natural, the value of such a natural area. So how likely will people be to visit a forest with large mammals or not? Or how much would they be willing to pay for a nature area in additional taxes each year with if there are more natural processes in such a nature area? That's what we try to do in this consortium. So that was a brief little background of what we do, but now I want to go to one of the cases that we've been working on to try to make this example a bit clearer. So in Denmark, we've been studying a case that deals with rewilding. So in Denmark, there's been a plan for the last years to create so-called national parks. So we had national parks, but then we want to create nature national parks. And the plan was to create 15 of these sort of rewilding reserves, which was the key component to it was introducing large grazing animals in fenced nature areas. Right? So we introduce a fence to keep these animals in place and to make sure that they don't move away too much and that we can have a high grazing pressure in an area. And that was all done with the ambition to improve biodiversity in these areas. But this plan has been quite contentious. So there's been quite some people that really come out in positively, but there are also quite some opponents with different arguments to why these nature national parks are a bad idea. In general, it's been quite a polarized debate, and we wanted to understand this debate more. So we've been asking people through a survey sort of questions related to this topic or to rewilding in general. So we've been asking what type of animal, if they would be introduced in these forests, what type of animal do people prefer? But we also want to understand this combination of fencing and animals. And we want to put this in perspective, right? So how important is this rewilding if we compare it to other aspects of your forest visit? So how does that exactly look? Well, we sent out a survey to a representative sample of 20,000 Danes over the last year, where we asked them which forest would you like to visit in the coming period. And on your screen, you can see an example of one of these questions that how that looked like. So we could see that on the one, we have some of these structural forest attributes, as we call them. So is the forest a broadleaf forest, or is it a coniferous forest? How is the age structure of this forest? That's on the top. We have the distance to the forest, all the way at the top, which is very important. So how far would you travel? And we have these animals and fences, right? So we have both different animals that could be present in the forest, but also the height of the fence, the type of access point through the fence, and the number of places there is access. So either access only main road or multiple roads. And we even asked about dog access, whether you were allowed to bring your dog or not. So a somewhat complex choice, but we repeated this over a large sample for a lot of people, and we asked them constantly, which of these forests would you like to visit? Would you like to visit, for example, forest A, B, or would you like to do something else entirely? And the results from that study, I would like to talk a bit more about. So what we see, for example, if we take in sort of on an average level, we see that people least prefer these kind of cattle animals that are proposed. And we see that then animals that are native, like already to the and already widely present in Denmark, such as red deer, they're most preferred. And then in between, we have a number of animals, and the willingness to travel of some of these for some of these animals is quite substantial. So we see that, for forest with red deer, people are willing to travel 20 kilometers more than if this would be a forest that has cattle with horn. But of course, then comes the question also, how does this sort of compare to if you would have a forest without animals? Now, it's important to realize that whenever I've talk about these animals, you have to see them in conjunction with fences. So we've only asked, whenever there's been an animal, there's also been a fence. So all of these animals also include a fence. So if we compare with a forest that has no animals and also no fence, we can see that for some animals with a fence, it's actually a negative component, and for some animals, it's more of a positive component. And we see that one thing that matters there is how much access you get through the fence. So the number of access points through the fence influences kind of when this balance switches from positive to negative as well. But as we mentioned before, it's kind of a polarized debate. So I want to get to that in a minute. But if we actually one moment when we stop at the fences, we can see that although we just mentioned, that more access through the fence is important, we don't really see differences between these access points here that we described. So we had gates, we had cow grates, we had ladders. We don't see that people really care about that difference. But like I mentioned, it's a very polarized debate. So what we try to do also is to try to see if we can identify different groups within the population. And this this figure that you see here, it's sort of complex, but I just want to break it down a bit towards what we see. What we can see is that around 70% of our sample is positive to visiting a forest that has these animals present, and these fences present, and around 30% is negative. And of the ones that are negative, there's one very specific group that really primarily cares about whether they can bring their dog or not. So that's a group, and then there's one that is really negative towards having animals introduced in the forest. So we can really see also in our results some of those outcomes that we've talked before, in terms of the debate. We can see this polarization also in our results as well. But what is quite interesting to us, at least what stood out, is that even if we look to the groups that are negative and positive, we still see a similar preference order in terms of the animals. So although these people that are very opposed to this, for all of these animals, they would prefer not to visit this forest. They do have a preference that that red deer, they do prefer to visit a forest with a red deer than they would prefer to have with a cattle with horn. And we can see that this preference order between the group that is negative and positive looks quite similar, where you would have some of these more livestock animals, these sort of more domesticated animals, seem to be less preferred than what you might argue in some cases more wilder, or at least these less domesticated animals in many people's vision. So we found that to be quite interesting, that despite we see these two groups, one being positive and one being negative, we do see that in terms of the preference order of some of these animals, there are some similarities. And then I just want to put, we have a lot of these components, and I want to put the importance of these rewilding in large herbivores and recreation a bit into perspective. We also asked at the same time about some of these structural forest attributes, and we see that the difference between, the least preferred and most preferred animals, so the cattle with horn and the red deer, the willingness to travel, right? How far they're willing to travel to visit this forest is kind of similar if we look to the difference between whether it's a coniferous or broadleaf forest. So this rewilding is very important. It's an important driver of recreational value, as we can see, but it's all we cannot underestimate also the relation with the importance of these structural attributes as well. And so it's just dog access. Now this has been a Danish case. There's been a bit of other research around Europe through rewilding as well. So we've been talking a lot about these large herbivores, large grazing animals. There's been a study in 22 by Gejinshi et al., and I hope I pronounced that name correctly, that looked more at the impact of large carnivores, and they actually see a similar component, that they have this split in two main groups, one very positive, one very negative, and where the positive group seems to be the bigger group, but that the negative preferences for are more pronounced. And interestingly, if you compare this same combination, how important is this rewilding compared to some of these structural forest attributes? So again, sort of broadleaf and components they also included. We see that it's similar. So the most preferred forest over the least preferred forest in these structural components, the willingness to travel for one over the other is around 15 kilometers and 25 in Poland and 15 in Norway, which, if you look at the graph to the right, is quite aligned with also these willingness to travel estimates for the large carnivores. So there we somewhat aligned. And I also want to highlight that We've been talking now about animals and a bit about structural forest attributes, but rewilding, and especially in the forest management space, has been a lot of the components that we now would consider rewilding, natural regeneration of forest, dead wood presence, and some of those things. There's been quite some research already on that in the last decades in the environmental valuation space, where we can see that there's quite some research done on what is the impact of some of these specific attributes, such as leaving dead wood in the forest, or how does the structure of the forest looks on recreational value or on the value in general. One study that I've listed here from 2015, I've just listed it primarily because it's quite a comprehensive list of different attributes that they've looked at, right? So they've looked at dead wood and forest diversity, and so all of these components where they've done some of these valuations. So we know that there is some research there as well. And I don't want to go into too much detail on that. I just want to highlight with, for example, one example of this silviculture system, so the way how do you actually you're clearing, we can see that decisions in that have a really big impact on the recreational value of forest, which makes a lot of sense, of course, but this is also similar for some of these other attributes. So I just wanted to highlight that research exists, and that there's already quite some good insights that we can find from there as well. This has been a really quick run through of some of the findings that we have so far. As part of wildE, our team is moving not just at the recreational value space, but moving broader towards the societal value space. We're looking at benefits of rewilding in the Dutch context, in the Dutch riverine context, how to support, but we're also looking in the mountain context, in the Tatras mountain. Colleagues of us are looking more at the cost side, so both at what the opportunity costs and other costs are of rewilding in Europe, and we would try to synthesize that. And I also want to highlight for those that are interested in this is that there have been a recent interesting study where they've looked at the rewilding framework, so and rewilding in the Oder Delta, and tried to value there as well. It's done Bredahl that I'm highlighted here. But for now, Jette, I just wanted to ask you. You've been involved in this research as well. What are some of the questions that sort of stood out for you?
Yeah, thank you, Tim, and thank you for a nice overview of some of the essential findings. So one thing that I think is striking in both the Polish-Norwegian study you mentioned, and the one that we did in Denmark, is that there seem to be a minority in the population who have very strong negative preferences, and then a majority who have less strong but positive preferences. And that means that if we think of it in a perspective from how do we manage nature such that people in a society get the most out of it, then there are clearly many small winners, but a few very big losers. So how do we balance that?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a difficult and complicated question, and I can maybe give some pointers from our research. So in the essence, we have asked people here now what they want, but you could see that some of maybe the people that have really strong preferences, as also we've shown, are also the people that might be more willing to go out and speak up and say some of these things. So we might see them more in the debate, and we might see that those preferences in that sense might drive policy stronger than some of the other ones, right? Some of the other ones might be mostly because we've asked them and then they've given their opinion. What I do find interesting in the results from our research that come to this public policy and how to do is that despite opposition there are clearly some choices you can make around the rewilding implementation that might be better or worse for certain groups. And I think that is interesting and important to take into consideration to go beyond this research shows that, you know, we can go beyond the question, do you want it, yes or no, but also how would you want it, and can we in any ways mitigate some of these negative effects that you might be experiencing. I'm not sure how would you reflect on this yourself a bit more?
I was that is definitely a thing, right? That is, but I think also that it's not only positive or negative. There's also, and I think that is actually one of the big strengths of the method applied here, that we do not only measure who are against or who are for, but we are measuring the strength of how much against and how much for are we. So while if we just make a referendum and said, are you for or against, we would conclude that, well, people are for rewilding, so that we should do it. But if we say that people who care a lot somehow have a higher saying, we should weight, you can say, the utility or how much they dislike it, then you would probably end more in the negative direction, because some of the negative preferences are so strong. So I think that is at least a consideration to make, not only who, because I think it's a fair point you're raising, those are also the very loud ones. But they are also the ones who have a strong opinion. And I think that is, in the end, an ethical and democratic choice to do. But I think that are some of the problems that we face in the decision making when we implement rewilding. So another thing I was thinking, Tim, is that you have these preferences over the different animals, and at least in the Danish case study, it was very clear that the animal we have that lives wild already in some of the parts, the red deer, is the most preferred animal, and some of them, especially the domesticated ones, are less preferred relative, and that goes both, as you pointed out before, both for the negative and the positive range. But quite a bit of the rewilding debate is also about increasing the trophic complexity of the ecosystem, so introducing carnivores as well. And you showed the example from the Polish and Norwegian study, which you can say is very different from a densely populated country like Denmark, where we got rid of the wolf 200 years ago and haven't had any dangerous animals except from the tick in Denmark since. So when the wolf came back relatively recently, it has caused quite a huge debate. So how do you, of course, you haven't included it in the study here, but how would you see the differences? So the findings you have in the Polish and Norwegian case, do you think such findings could be carried over to the Danish or the Dutch case if we were to introduce large carnivores in these more urbanized countries, or at least densely populated countries?
Yeah, I think what we see, you know, so in both cases, in the case what we've done with the herbivores here in Denmark, but also in Poland and Norway, we see this this split between groups, right? We see a very positive and we see a very negative group. I would expect that would be there as well in Denmark if we're talking about carnivores, and it might be a bit more pronounced than we have with the herbivores. We've seen that herbivores, one of the reasons why people might not like it has been a component of fear, or that is one of the reasons why people might not like having large herbivores in a recreational area. One might reasonably possibly expect that for carnivores, this fear component might be even stronger, right? So you would expect that maybe more pronounced preferences are there. In terms of exactly how the split between positive and negative turns out, I'm not too sure. We would have to look at that. My guess would be that there might be more people that are somewhat afraid of such large carnivores. We see, we see a bit of a split. The people who are very positive are people from the cities. If we talk about these groups, people that are cities and that are somewhat younger. And we see already in the Netherlands now that these wolves are coming also closer to the cities, it's changing a bit the thoughts from, it's a far away situation where it's nice to think about to something that actually enters my immediate surrounding, and then it seems to change people's thought process around some of these animals. So that's what I would argue. You've done a bit of research to wolves in Denmark, so I'm not sure what you would say.
Yeah, we did a survey a number of years ago to farmers. So that was just when the wolf reappeared in Denmark, and some of the discussions was what we tried to make. Again, we used the same method, but to try to reveal what would farmers do if they found wolf on their farm, and then we included different, both the legal and illegal metrics that they could do. So they could do something to favor that the wolf was there. They could do something to scare it away, or they could even shoot it. And by a very detailed design, we actually made it possible for them to reveal illegal behavior. And that was what turned out to be the result, that farmers stated that they would shoot it, despite that we tried to hide. I mean, so we hided it so they could say it. You can say they could always argue in a choice that they had taken something else, but statistically we could derive that it was shooting that they stated. Of course, there's a strategic element in this one when they answer a survey like that, because they also want to show that it's a big problem. So how many would actually shoot it? I am probably more doubtful, but at least they wanted to send a signal to the research that we were doing that this was a serious concern and they wouldn't like it. So I think that is for sure one of the things, but that has a lot to do with husbandry, I think, but it also has to do with fear, as you were pointing out, and especially when we see people getting confronted with wildlife of various sorts, that is dangerous or not, it causes conflict, and it is one of the big problems as I see it, how to deal with that. On one hand, accepting that animals are dangerous sometimes, and especially if you do not come in, how can we say, if you don't know how to react when there are animals close by, but and then a question of how big a risk will we as society take, even if it is very small. But of course, we do take risks in many other places. The classic example is to compare it with the amount of accidents with dogs, for example, that we have many more of every year. So we do, as a society, we are willing to take risk, but this is of course also a risk that is taken, you can say, on society as such overall.
Thank you. I think we would like to hear a bit from the people attending. So James?
Yes, thanks, Tim. Yeah, that was really interesting. And we've also started to get some really interesting questions in the chat as well. So after we run this Mentimeter session, we'll go into the open Q&A session. So if you do have any questions, just a reminder to please post those in the Zoom chat. So this first question is a bit of a, well, it's a quiz question, so there is a correct answer to this question. And the question is, which of these animals is involved in the most accidents with recreational visitors to natural areas in Europe? So we'll let you put your answers in, and then at a certain point we'll reveal which answer is the correct answer. Either Tim or Jette, if you want to sort of comment on the responses coming in, or let me know when you want me to reveal the answer, you're more than welcome to jump in.
Well, I like what's already
No, that's giving, is that giving the answer away?
Without giving the answer away. But I'm seeing that there's some differences. There are a few animals in there. Clearly, the sheep is not seen as an animal with a lot of accidents, which makes a lot of sense. And also bison, which is of course in very few places right now still in Europe and is there. But I think the example is becoming clearer and clearer. I might have given it away already, but yes, cattle is definitely the one where we see most accidents, and we see that especially in combination with people that have dogs and that bring dogs to natural areas and the conflicts around there.
Yeah, so I think that just to add on I mean, there's of course two elements here, right? One is how widespread are the animals. We do have a lot of cattle around Europe, so that of course also plays a role, but also that we get close to them.
Thanks. So our next question is more of an open-ended question, so you should be able to type in a few sentences or a few words, and we were just interested in the emotions, thoughts, or concerns that come to mind when you think about rewilding and its relationship to recreation. So yeah, I mean, we were just interested to see what would come up with this question, and we'll sort of reflect on those thoughts as they come in. You can type full sentences or just one or two words is also no problem at all. But yeah, really interested to see what comes into this one. Hope and renewal. That's a nice one to start us off.
Interesting, the things that we're seeing here. So we have people who are really looking at from a recreational component, you know, the adventure or even a safari that they can see. It's really about this component of seeing them, but it's also a lot of elements that we're seeing here about these, on one end, balancing this component of maybe liking some components or being fascinated by it, but also a lot of these things we've been talking about, some of these conflicts or maybe some sort of uncertainty about how it will actually go. And actually here, a lot of people who are also taking it to themselves, which is really nice to see. So what can this bring to them? A connection to nature, or experience, opportunity to be the experience, like a true nature. So we can see that that it brings different things to different people. This and it might have positives and negatives to other things. What stands out for you, Jette, if you see some of these points?
Yeah, I think also the fascination, I think, is one of the things that I think many are pointing at, right? Fascination for nature, and the idea of rewilding being a way to educate future generations, which is a very, you can say, paternalistic approach to the role and the importance of nature, but also caring for the future that it reflects. So I think these are some of the things, but we also see the aspects of conflicts, and I think another striking one is this this urban versus rural, that I think comes in many of the points raised here, that who is it who are gaining, who is it who are losing, and that depends on where we are talking about rewilding.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to highlight from what we've been looking at, is that there really is a balance, right? That we really have positive and negative emotions around this topic, and that we really do see that some people really like it, but that we also see a lot of concerns around what might it restrict? Might it restrict access? Might it restrict opportunities of things you can do? And we can see that the concern here highlighted a lot, which is an important concern to be taken into consideration when we're doing policy research as well. Really cool to see. Lots of interesting responses. James, maybe I'm looking a bit at the time. Maybe we should go to some of the questions.
Yeah, and I agree, that was a really interesting session, and you know, lots of diversity of views, so hopefully we get some diversity of good questions as well. So yeah, please do post them in the chat, but I can start with the first question that came in, which was from Thomas. And Thomas he asked this during your presentation, Tim, about the surveys that you were talking about. And Thomas asked if you use different user categories in those surveys. So reflecting on, there's a big difference between individuals, tourists, organized groups like scouts and sports clubs, and if your surveys revealed any sort of information about how different sort of user categories or groups value rewilding in recreational spaces.
Interesting. Yeah, very nice question. Our survey is aimed at the general public, right? So we don't, we've taken a sample, representative sample of the Danish population, and we send it out there. So it should capture different groups. We also try to identify some of these groups. And one example that we, for example, see that the people that have a lot of experience handling large animals, maybe veterinarians and others, they actually fall within the group that they are more likely to fall within the group that is negative towards rewilding. So that's one of the sort of user groups that we can see, and we have other user groups that we've identified, but we haven't, at least here in this research, haven't really looked at the effects on this recreational value. But it's a good point, something that we can definitely take into the to try to see. I know that in previous research it definitely has been of importance. Jette, maybe you know a bit more about that as well?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna add that it is important to notice that we are serving the adult population, so not people below 18. And that's, I think it's a rather methodological or theoretical reason that it's the adult population that can vote. And ultimately, we are trying to say what would, if we had a direct referendum on these kind of decisions, what would people choose? And then it's that's the reason we have this 18 years threshold. But it does mean that preferences of children are only expressed through their parents' preferences. So I think that is important, and that would of course capture some of the interest groups like scouts and others. I think typically we do see some differences, especially related to some of the specific user groups that have certain interests. I think horseback riders is one of the groups that we know have strong opinions in the Danish debate from a survey that one of our colleagues, Christian Gambo, I don't know if he's in the audience, but he is also in the wildE project, and he has been doing a survey specifically looking into some of these things. So that is one of the user groups where we do see the conflicts, just like the dog owners. And we do know that some of the other ones, whether organized or not, typically come in and have stronger opinions on these things. And I think that goes a little bit back to the discussion we had before on the strength of preferences, that user groups are also typically the ones having a stronger strength of their preference because they use it more, so they're more affected by the decision.
Thank you. I'll just move on to the next question, but thanks for that answer, Tim and Jette. So the next question is from Nacho, who's Nacho says he's sort of looking at the results from the study, was slightly surprised that the supporters seem to value smaller animals, such as deer, higher than they value some of the larger animals like the bison or the horses or the bear, in terms of the distance they were willing to travel. So yeah, I guess Nacho's question is sort of why do you think on average supporters valued those sort of smaller animals, and why didn't they value some of the larger animals like the horses or the bears higher?
So I think in our study, the reason for the deer, I think that has less to do with size, but more with its position, that it's already a widespread animal in Denmark, and the people are familiar with it. So that where we can see, you know, for both the groups that are positive and negative to it, it's an animal that they know and has a positive connotation in culture, right? Visiting the red deer. But you know, some of these in these other studies, what we've seen is that fear kind of plays a role, and maybe also some other components. So then maybe these large animals are just kind of also scary animals, and as such, an animal that has like the lynx that has less chances of conflict, that also might become a physical conflict because it's an animal that is not very often in contact, and people might be less afraid of it, might be one of the drivers that we're seeing this component, that large animals might be scary. That could be one of the reasons. In Denmark, we're definitely seeing it's also a matter of which animal is supposed to seen as more wild. So that's what we found super interesting, is that some of these domesticated animals that might be seen as unnatural or not fitting to be set out in a forest like this for these sort of components are valued lower than some of the animals where people might think that they're more willing to thrive, or more able to thrive, and are more fitting to the setting. The people are prefer those animals. Yet I don't know if you have something to add to this.
Yeah, I think actually to the last point, I think it is a little bit interesting, because if it was fear alone that was leading it, then you would think that people would put the sheep higher,
Yeah.
right? And some of the domesticated ones, but maybe we are actually also seeing some duality in the perspective. So on one hand, wanting something that is more wild and more nature kind of, and on the other hand, also acknowledging that this means also bigger animals. So I think, yeah, size is a matter. The native part is indeed, I'm quite sure that is what plays into why the red deer is the most popular one. And I think there's probably another picture of Denmark being a small country, densely populated. We're talking about small areas. I mean, even if they are large for a Danish scale, they are small on a big scale. So I think many would question, do we have room? I mean, a bison is a big animal. It might need a lot of space. There's not space for that. So I think that is also some of the things that comes into play. And then I think specifically with the horses, there's a lot of the conflict that is related to horseback riders and caring for horses as the kind of pets, big pets they are. And that, I think, is one of the things that that plays into it. At least we see that horseback riders are quite distinct in their preferences for that. So there are likely many things that put in, and these are, you can say, these are some of our speculations of what come in. But I think if we have to be a little bit careful, right? We can notice what are the results, but the rest are our guesses and how we can characterize it. And the most solid characterization, I think, also if we look at some of the other studies that have been done, that is the question of domesticated versus wild, and native versus non-native. And by native, I mean having been here the last 100 years or so, right? Because we can always discuss whether some of the other ones are not native.
Thank you. So we have a question from Claire about dog owners, or people that you know, are more or less averse to dogs, and their attitudes to you know, large carnivores and other animals in recreational spaces. So Claire's done similar research in the Yorkshire Dales and found that people who didn't own a dog or were averse to dogs in recreational spaces were more likely to accept large carnivores or any animals overall. And they also expressed a willingness to fund recreational spaces where dogs are kept, asked to be kept on a lead. So Claire's question is, you know, if you could reflect on any similar patterns you've seen in terms of dog owners and their attitudes to large carnivores or other animals.
So what we can observe in terms of with dog owners, we can see that they are form this group that is negative towards most animal, like visiting a forest that has animals present there, but they're not as negative as this group that is really opposed to it. So they have a bit more balanced components, and we can also see that with some animals, they are okay-ish with it. But they are more, the dog owners are like more negative towards having large herbivores than these majority of the population that we've seen. This 70% of either really positive or somewhat positive towards these components. We can also see that well, there's some indications that bison is less preferred by dog owners than compared to the other groups. That the dog owners seem to like bison a bit less, but that's not really a strong signal. And we can actually see that the dog owners in this case, they were the only ones that also had a preference for sort of the fence access point design. So whereas the other people didn't really seem to care whether it was a cow grate, whether it was a fence or a ladder, the dog owners really didn't like the ladder, which makes sense. Who wants to carry their dog over a ladder in a way? So those are some of the things that we can see where the dog owners are different than the rest of the groups.
And which I think is completely rational, right? Most of the accidents are that we do see with animals are when dogs are involved. So in a way, it makes sense. I think rationally speaking, that if you have a dog, you are more concerned about some of these things. But I think one point that I would like to mention here is that the survey we have made is about where people would like to go for recreation. And that's not necessarily the same as saying that they are against rewilding in general. So when we look at it economically, we are often talking about that there are use values and there are non-use values. So the non-use values are the values that I would have of nature, regardless whether I use it or not. So that would not be recreation. And I think it's important to be aware of that the survey we have made here is targeted the recreational value. And thereby some of these conflicts might also be more pronounced than if we had made a survey that was about people's preference, broadly speaking, for it, including both use and non-use values.
Yeah, I think that addresses a question that's just come in, but I don't know if you want to reflect on it more. The question is, with the scale of biodiversity loss and climate change, why are we concerned with what dog owners, or I guess other recreational users, prefer in terms of value? If an action is has the greatest benefit for biodiversity and climate, shouldn't that always be the approach we take? So I mean, I guess it goes beyond dog owners, doesn't it?
I can reflect. Oh, would you, Tim?
Go for Jeff something.
Okay, yeah. No, I'm thinking, I mean, why do we care about what people believe about things? I think essentially the reason we care about that is two things. One is that we live in a democracy, and ultimately what we choose is what people want, or they vote on politicians who make policies of what people want, ideally. And then people can be misinformed or not. But not caring about people is a challenging one, to say that we should do nature management without considering what people believe. I think that is a fundamental technocratic decision way. So that would be one thing. The other thing I think is when we look at it from our economic approach and the theoretical basis that we have for that, there we often work with what we call a social planner perspective that looks at utility of everybody. And that means that, yes, we do care about some of dog owners' preferences, also because if we are concerned about biodiversity conservation, climate change, and other things, this can be a barrier for actually implementing some of the policies. So I think that is also why we care about it, that ultimately it's a question of pragmatism. So it's a piece of information for pragmatism, I think. And the other one is, of course, the question of who are to decide in a society.
Thanks. And then we're running low on time, so I might just ask one more question, but we have got some unanswered questions in the chat. But feel free to carry on posting your questions. And what we can do is we've got everybody's email address from when you signed up, and we're more than happy to follow up after this webinar. So I think the final question I'll go to is from Nicola, who asks, you know, I think we talked about it before about how, you know, the wolves or the bears, you know, were eradicated from lots of countries 200 years ago or more. So what's sort of changing in society that means, you know, these rewilding ideas and reintroduction of maybe large carnivores is being considered by society? And yeah, are there any sort of changes more recently that are happening in this space, or that have happened over the last, you know, 100 years that mean we're now, you know, having this debate and potentially looking at more reintroduction?
That's a difficult question. It's not necessarily really something that I've looked at. I think it's also whether there's more acceptance or not. I think there was probably a lot of acceptance when these animals were still further away. But you can see now in the Netherlands that now that the conflict is increasing, the acceptance is also changing, right? And we have you know, the EU policy regarding some of these animals is also changing. So I'm not completely sure if how the acceptance looks like in an area where there is an established population of large carnivores, and whether this is how this has changed over time. Don't know how qualified I am to make a statement about that, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's a big question, and I also I mean, we haven't made surveys 100 years ago. So there are some of these systematic approaches that we can't answer, right? But of course we can look at what role have wildlife played. But I think there are people who are better qualified to answer that question than me, that have looked into the role of wildlife over the last 100 years and our relation to it. But one thing we do see, of course, is an increased urbanization in the population that matters for the preference. And also one thing that we also know from the economic side, that would be that there's, at least theoretically, it has been argued that the richer society gets, the more they care about things that are not directly use oriented, but are more broadly, simply because they can afford it. You can say, so if you use metrics like willingness to pay or willingness to travel, as we have here, well, you can only do that if you actually have spare time you can spend on traveling, and you have a car or something so you can go the long distances. If you have to walk, you would probably not put a willingness to travel of 40 kilometers to go and see a bison. So some of these things are related to the income level, and that is also one thing where we can see that in society there has been a lot of changes over the last 100 years, and that will likely matter as well.
So thanks, Tim and Jette, for that. I mean, and thanks everyone in the audience for those really great questions. We're out of time for today. I saw a final reflection from Nacho in the chat that there are actually some EU elections taking place this week, which are going to have a big impact on environmental regulations and rewilding. So just a reminder for everyone who can vote, you know, to get out and vote. But I don't know if Tim or Jette want to share any final quick reflections, and then we'll close this webinar for today, and just remind you all that it will be available online to watch the recording if you'd like.
No, I think the only last comment I would have is that if any of you have questions that you really would like to discuss with us, feel free to send us an email, and we will try to answer as good as we can by email.
Yeah, and last thing is that do follow the wildE. We're just one as part of a series, and there will be more coming along the way. And also our research will still develop over time. I saw there were some questions about restoring natural hydrology and some other things. These are things we're trying to study in the broader wildE. So follow the Green Shoot series and maybe some of the questions will be answered along the way.
Thanks, everybody. I put a link in the chat to subscribe to our newsletter to find out about the next webinar, which will most likely take place in October. So thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.